I want to ask you first, what drew your attention to President Coolidge in the first place?
Sure. Well, I was writing a book about presidents and the books they'd written, and there were obviously some presidents I was really excited to talk about, like Teddy Roosevelt or Abraham Lincoln, these presidents that we think of and we think of their skill with a pen. Frankly, Calvin Coolidge was not on that list when I started working on my book, but it quickly became clear that he should be on that list and that maybe he did not get the credit that he deserved as a writer. I always think about two kinds of presidential books. There's campaign books, which is how people kind of get to the White House, and then there's legacy books, which is kind of that classic presidential memoir where they reflect on their time and get a nice paycheck and that sort of thing. And Coolidge wrote a wonderful example of each. He had a campaign book, Have Faith in Massachusetts, that really helped him secure the vice presidential nomination. It's a wonderful book with really great speeches that he wrote himself and revised very carefully. And then he wrote an autobiography that even a lot of Coolidge scholars still don't appreciate how popular it was. It made Coolidge the most discussed man in America. It was the most discussed book in America in 1929 when it came out. And it's a book that's still really wonderful to read today because he was a great writer and he was willing to talk about himself not as a politician. He didn't want to list all the things he had achieved. He wanted to talk about himself as a person. And so to have somebody who had been in the White House who could talk about the personal costs and the personal expectations and the personal achievements, I wish more politicians would follow it. He's one of the best presidential authors we've ever had. People knew that at the time. The New York Times called him the most literary occupant of the White House since Lincoln. We all just kind of forgot it. So one thing I enjoyed doing with my book was sort of rediscovering and reclaiming that legacy because I think it's one of Coolidge's best.
Fantastic. What was the theme of your remarks at the conference?
Well, I focused on Coolidge as a writer, and I tried to talk about the impact of his books and how he worked so hard on writing his speeches. There's an anecdote I just love where his wife, Grace, who's a really good writer herself, she would talk about how he would revise his speeches, write them in pencil, work on them, normally make them shorter because he was, of course, a very concise person. And he would be so nervous and frustrated, and this just isn't any good. And then he would get up and deliver the speech, and he would see her later and be like, I guess that was an okay speech after all. And that's just such a writer's moment. I mean, he was a politician, obviously, but anyone who knows a writer knows that that's how they feel about their work, too. And so seeing that side of him and bringing that side of him to the audience was really exciting for me because his writing also made him an effective politician. It's one of the reasons he was popular. It's one of the reasons he was able to advocate for his ideas. And so he was a really talented communicator who could take advantage of different media like the telegram or the radio or old-fashioned media like the book.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything important about Coolidge that you may not have had a chance to talk about in your public remarks at the conference?
I mentioned this briefly, but I think one thing people sometimes forget is just how effective he was as a celebrity. And celebrity can be a bad thing about politicians. Certainly it feels that way nowadays a lot of times, but celebrity is also a tool. And Coolidge was very good at using the tools of the presidency to achieve the political goals that he wanted to. So we always think of FDR and his fireside chats as an example of the president using the radio, but Coolidge was using national broadcasts very effectively before FDR. And so I really think it's worth emphasizing how good Coolidge was in working with the media, working with newsreels, working with news photographers, or working on the radio, and being able to communicate his message. You know, in one of his most famous radio broadcasts, he talks and says, I love that my father is listening in from the farm in Vermont. And of course, that's a very relatable moment because many Americans were still so surprised and excited by the way that radio could make everyone have a national experience at the same time. Coolidge was being very relatable in that moment. But he also was subtly reminding people that, you know, we're living in this crazy new world, but I'm just a simple person from Vermont. And his ability to balance new celebrity and old celebrity, his ability to use the tools of a new world while still embodying the virtues and the values of the old world, that's why he was such an enormously popular politician. And his popularity, I think, just still gets overlooked even by people who love Coolidge. You know, his reputation has gone up and down, but he was, at the time, he was an enormously popular president, an enormously popular figure.
My understanding is that one of the reasons that we don't know as much about his radio broadcasts is because they weren't recorded.
I don't know.
I believe they talked about that in the movie.
Right, yeah, that may be, I unfortunately haven't seen the documentary yet. That sounds right to me. I'm not, you know, in my book, when I would talk about his radio broadcasts, I would often see newspaper coverage. Right. So like when his son died, the funeral service was carried on radios all around the country. And so I read newspaper accounts that would quote the radio and things like that. I never actually got to listen to any radio broadcasts. So certainly, you know, the further a medium goes along, the more of it is preserved. So there was not as much preserved with him as somebody
Luckily, we have
like
the
FDR.
transcripts.
Exactly.
Yeah. Did you learn anything at the conference that you feel needs to be emphasized now that it's Coolidge's centennial year?
one thing I really liked that came out of our panel, and I think everybody contributed to this, was this just idea of Coolidge not just as a writer, but as a reader, as a thinker. And so some of the Coolidge scholars were asking, what can we do? Which I think is admirable. That kind of self-awareness and self-desire is great. And what our panel kind of urged everybody to do was to read, was to think. And not just read or think about the things that line up with your personal politics, but read and think about things that are different from them. And go to those primary texts that are so important for the making and the formation of American history, and use those to try to make your own ideas. And so I really liked that our panel talked about that, and I think that's something that Americans have always liked to read about their past and their present and their politics, and I hope that's a tradition that never goes away.
Yeah. Was there, since you were on the panel and listening to some other speakers today, was there anything that you have learned or maybe decided to emphasize a little bit more, or some new insights that you've gathered from?
I really liked Matthew Spaulding's comments about Coolidge as a statesman. In my work, I tend to really look into context, and so if I'm writing about Coolidge, I'm going to think about, well, how many houses in America had radios, and what were they also listening to on the radio, and how do cars, Coolidge was a terrible driver, and I put a fun anecdote in my book about how bad he was at driving, but also how much people recognized him because of his celebrity. So I'm always thinking about, trying to contextualize and look for context and things like that. But that's not the only way to write about or think about presidents. And one thing I liked about Matthew Spaulding's comments was he thought about Coolidge as a statesman. He kind of created this timeless category to compare not Coolidge to his contemporaries, but Coolidge to Lincoln or to Washington. And so I appreciated Spaulding's comments in that regard.
Fantastic. Is there anything else that you would like to add? Being that this is the Centennial Conference, the first time we've done a conference like this, and we're celebrating his 100th anniversary of his presidency. Is this kind of an opportunity to really boost the Coolidge legacy?
Sure. I think he has a really strong legacy. And the one thing I would say, this will probably get edited for sure, the one thing I would say is that a lot of people tended to talk about Coolidge as if he was a 21st century conservative. And I don't agree with that assessment at all. If you go back and look at it, there's a lot of compassion and a lot of humanity, and he might not necessarily be someone who's advocating for mass regulations. He wasn't FDR, and I wouldn't claim that he was. But he wasn't somebody who was advocating for the dismantling of the administrative state either. And so this just gets back to the other point. If you're interested in Coolidge or you're interested in American history, go back and read what they had to say. And I think you'll find that the worst thing to do is to completely try to understand Coolidge through your own lens in your own time. I think he's a much more interesting and complicated thinker and politician than that. And so going back and looking at him, you'll find some things that are still very conservative, but you might find some things that are kind of like surprisingly progressive too. And that's just because the politics in America is an ongoing debate where, the terms change a little bit as we go on. And so with Coolidge, with Lincoln, with Wilson, with anybody, the solution, I think, is to read what they wrote and to read it for yourself and think for yourself. And you'll not just learn what they're talking about, you'll become a better reader and thinker yourself.